and try to empower the State Water Board to do the right thing. If they see a massive amount of people coming from different backgrounds who take the time to testify, it has a really big impact. So this process is very political, and that's going to be a big focus of this talk with Max. But anyone who is not already signed up to speak at one of the hearings, but who's interested, please let me know. I'm going to be circulating some talking points later today. We videotaped a preparation meeting we had a couple weeks ago, so we make it really easy. And if you don't want to wait around all day to speak, just let me know and I'll text you when you're coming up. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible. So Max, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. Perhaps you can start by giving us just a little bit of background about yourself and how you ended up at the State Water Board, where you worked for 10 years, and what your role was there.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thank you, Peter and Abby, for organizing this event. It's great to be able to talk to people about water and what I've seen and experienced in the water world over almost 2 decades now. So, to your question, Peter, I sort of fell into water the way that many of us do. Through a series of chance events as I was coming up in my career. But prior to the Water Board, I worked for the consumer advocate at the Public Utilities Commission. And the Public Utilities Commission consumer advocate is sort of unique among the 50 states in that in California, the consumer advocate is part of the commission. You're staff of the commission, but it's this quasi-independent agency that is there to try to advocate on behalf of ratepayers of the gas and electric utilities and for other consumer protections that are regulated. And in California, 15% of the domestic water supply is served by investor-owned utilities that are regulated by that commission. And so in the consumer advocate, the staff look at these every 3-year filings on their request for rate increases to build more tanks and pumps and fix distribution lines and make other investments and all of the expenses for operations and maintenance that go into running a water utility and cost allocation and rate design. So you really get to see the ins and outs of the financial element of water supply in the state. And I enjoyed that work. Spent a lot of time working on a number of issues relative to water supply on the Monterey Peninsula, including desalination and dam removal and fisheries recovery on the Carmel River in the context of consumer advocacy. What I realized after several years there was that if I wanted to have a statewide impact, I needed to be in Sacramento. Being in an agency whose primary responsibility is oversight of electric and gas utilities just isn't the place to be if you want to work on water. And so I made the jump at the beginning of 2012 to the State Water Board, where I spent a decade. I initially joined the State Water Board to be the climate advisor for the agency. The agency had positions that were created vis-a-vis AB 32, which was the state's climate law passed back in 2006. And so I joined to really work on climate policy. And then the drought got worse. Beginning in 2014, and I sort of shifted over to really focusing on drought full time over several years, and then over time I expanded my portfolio to affordability and sort of broader policy within the board and its various functions. And for those who may not know the board, sort of closely, the board actually does a number of different things, and over the past approximately decade, its role has vastly expanded. It was primarily just a water quality and water rights administering entity, Its financial assistance capacity has vastly expanded. It now has oversight of drinking water quality. It has responsibility over groundwater management now with Sigma conservation rules. More data. So what the water board does is really much broader and bigger than it was when I joined, which I think is a good thing because the water board is a regulatory agency, and I am a believer in the power of well-crafted regulation to achieve everything from environmental remediation to consumer protection and transparency in the way that our environment is managed.
Max, thank you for all you've done and for being such a ideal employee and representative of the people. We need a lot more of you. Now, in the summer of 2022, you famously resigned from the State Water Board. Can you tell us a little bit about that process and why you left?
Yeah. So the State Water Board is one of several agencies that operate under the California Environmental Protection Agency. It's the State Water Board and the State Air Board, along with agencies that are responsible for recycling and toxics and pesticides. And the Water Board and the Air Board are really supposed to be these independent regulatory agencies. Their members, in the case of the Water Board, are all appointed by the governor. The Air Board has appointees from other places as well. And the idea is they're there to set regulations on behalf of the public and the environment. And they're supposed to, those board members are supposed to be independent, making decisions based on things like science and sort of the needs of ecosystems. And while all chief executives, whether it's mayor, governor, president, always sort of as part of their goal, their political goals, tell the executive branch agencies what to do. There is a very big difference between those that let their regulators do their job and those that interfere to the point of really impeding the process of regulation as a function of creating these important rules. And so what I saw in the transition from the Brown administration to the Newsom administration was really a change from an administration that was willing to let its regulatory agencies, its water board, make some tough decisions and put rules out there that not everyone liked, but that were in the interest, again, of the public, of the environment. And to a Newsom administration that really was not interested in that level of autonomy, where everything was sort of top-down controlled, very tied to explicit political goals. And so I imagine most people on here are aware, right, as the transition in governors took place, there was a switch made on chair of the board. The water board in 2018, just prior to the end of former Governor Brown's term, had made a decision about flows on the San Joaquin River and providing more water back into that river for the benefit of ecosystems and species. And Governor Newsom came in and sort of immediately put that on hold, switched out the leadership and set a very different course. And that really has continued. And while again, this Governor Newsom has done some important acts when it comes to environment and climate. His track record on water, with the notable exception of getting a drinking water, safe drinking water program through, which was very important. I don't want to minimize that, but with that notable exception, has been extremely adverse to healthy ecosystems, to a transition to a more sustainable agriculture in the state, to sort of protections for people It's been very much in favor of sort of large industries, large utilities, and what I'll just call the existing power structure. And that manifested in many different ways. But as I watched this happen over the course of several years from 2019 onward, and saw that the role, that the ability to even put ideas out there for things the board could do was so severely curtailed. It reaches a point. It reached a point where I felt like there wasn't much I could do to contribute internally at that point, and that I had done as much as I could, and it was time to leave and time to make a public statement about what was going on and why that level of sort of top-down political control in favor of sort of well-heeled interests was not in the service of climate change goals, was not in the service of the board and administration's stated goals around equity and racial justice, was not in the interest of protecting ecosystems.
So you were kind to give the governor credit for the Safe Drinking Water Act, but it sounds like there were some problems with the community advisory group. Is that something you could comment on?
Yeah, I'll just give this as an example of how this administration has functioned. So I was part of a leadership team within the Water Board in 2019 that was tasked with making sure that we had a sort of implementation plan ready to go as soon as the Safe Drinking Water Plan and associated funding passed through the legislature and was signed into law. We were meeting weekly with the former Secretary of Calipié, Jared Blumenfeld, and sort of going through everything from staffing needs to goals and metrics for how many systems we could get into compliance within certain timeframes, and a number of other aspects of putting together a $130 million a year plan for improving safe drinking water outcomes. My role, one of them within that group, was to put together a community advisory committee that was part of the law, that the board would have this community advisory committee to help it spend the money in a way that was responsive to communities. And so we put that together and thought that essentially it would be fine. It was an advisory committee. It didn't have any formal authority in terms of influencing decisions of the board. It was advisory in nature, and it seemed fine. And then all of a sudden, the word came down one day that the governor's office needed to see the list and wanted to approve it. It went to the governor's office, and when it came back, the list had been altered. And it had been altered in a way to add representatives from large agricultural associations onto the advisory committee, and remove a couple of the community members. And that really was the last straw for me in terms of feeling like I didn't want to be working at the board within this administration. But that's really one small example of a number of actions that they've taken to impede the board's ability to perform its independent regulatory function.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think motivates Governor Newsom?
So it's really hard to guess other people's motivations. There's the usual things that get said about ambitious politicians, which is that mainly what is motivating them is fame and power. I think it is clear that Governor Newsom is an ambitious politician. It's harder to know what's motivating his decisions on water. I think it could be one of a few different things, and it's hard to know which one is dispositive, and no one except him and maybe anyone he's spoken to in his inner circle really knows. But there are a couple things to keep in mind when we think about Governor Newsom. The first is that he came out of what I'll call the San Francisco sort of political machine. that has produced a number of very powerful and influential politicians. Think Dianne Feinstein, think Nancy Pelosi, think Kamala Harris, Willie Brown, others. There's been a dynamism to politicians coming up out of San Francisco. But politicians coming up out of San Francisco, when they reach statewide and national prominence, have generally been pretty willing to support the agricultural status quo in the state, take money from the big players in that industry, and to not worry so much about pushback from the environmental community as a result of those political and sort of funding decisions. And that was a hallmark of Feinstein's tenure in the Senate. And I think Newsom is sort of following in those footsteps. He's made a calculus. I think it's safe to say that he is not going to be that harmed on the statewide and national stage by these decisions he's making in water. I think the second thing to sort of keep in mind about him is what his first business was. His first business was a wine business. And so he has ties to that industry. And my guess is he is sympathetic to, personally sympathetic to the arguments from that industry about why there shouldn't be more regulation and why they should get to keep using the majority of the water. Obviously, as people are mentioning in the chat, right, he's very ambitious. He has national aspirations. I don't think that's a mystery at this point any longer. The other thing that I have heard mentioned, and again, I don't have any particular insight here, is that there are members of his inner circle who are very strongly pro sort of agricultural status quo, who come from sort of family farming dynasties, or who have sort of deep connections to the powers, sort of the big powers in the valley. And he has said, publicly, and I think he's gotten part of this right, that the valley has been neglected. And when I say the valley, I primarily mean the San Joaquin, but I think it's really the whole valley, the Sacramento, San Joaquin together. The valley has been neglected, and that the state just hasn't done enough to support marginalized communities in the valley. And I think that part is true. Where I think the leap has come, where and I'm not sure again how he has reached this, is that therefore the solution to that is to allow the same powers that have sort of shaped the valley to dictate how the sort of the regulatory policy should look going forward. And I think it really is a huge disservice to both current populations and future generations, of course, as well as to the environment, because it deprives us of looking at pathways for a climate resilient transition. Even what I'll call sort of status quo supporting entities out there like PPIC have now acknowledged in writing that a lot of acres are going to have to come out of production. There's just no way to maintain 8+ million irrigated acres in California, given our increasing severity of sort of climate hydrology, as well as all of the underlying issues that sort of precede climate impacts, if you will, from just unsustainable levels of groundwater pumping to a vastly over-allocated and inequitable water rights system. So why it is, again, that he has made the decisions he's made, I don't have any more insight than anyone else on here. I just have the observations that I've shared and what I've seen.
Yeah, I appreciate everything you said right there. And I agree that we need to pay more attention to San Joaquin Valley. We do a lot of work there. And a big problem is discrepancy in wealth between the really rich and the poor farm workers. And we have to keep in mind that 80% of the developed water used in California goes to agriculture, but it only supports 2% of the economy. So there's a problem there, and we need to diversify the economies there and put some love into the Central Valley. Just want to share another little story that Gavin Newsom's father, Judge Newsom, was a big proponent of wild and scenic status for the Tuolumne River back in the early 80s. And he worked closely with a lot of my predecessors, and he got the San Francisco establishment on board. And in 1984, we got federal wild and scenic status. And after Judge Newsom passed away, there was an event and Gavin Newsom spoke. They were launching a foundation, and Gavin talked about how they grew up on rivers and rafting and canoeing. His dad loved it. And they even adopted a little injured otter named Potter the Otter that lived with them. And it just always has struck me that, he was raised right, but something happened. I think it's, the political ambitions, but, I thought we could make a little bit more progress with him. You also mentioned inequitable water rights, and I think you've done some work around tribal beneficial uses and the fact that it's getting a lot of attention now that water rights are inherently racist, that indigenous people couldn't own land and therefore the water. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening on that front?
Unfortunately, not a whole lot is happening, but I do think that the number of voices calling for change is growing, which is a good thing, because it's hard to think of a more unjust system when you think about how people initially acquired rights by displacing indigenous people, and how a lot of successive waves of immigrants were not able to own and acquire land and water rights. It's an extremely unjust system. And then, of course, the people who initially benefited turned that benefit into a sort of generational stream of wealth through sweetheart contracts with the federal government, primarily the Bureau of Reclamation, when the initial projects, the Central Valley project was being built. And so the successors of those people now enjoy these contracts where they get all their water, no matter what, no matter how bad the drought is, and if they do get cut back, it's by a pretty small amount. And they get it virtually for free. And it's just sort of astonishing to see that, that gross inequity, perpetuated into the contemporary era. And so, a lot of structural injustice in society is layered, right? And it sort of grows over time in some ways. And we've definitely seen that with the water rights system. And unfortunately, right, there is now voices calling for these sort of modest reforms. We saw, legislation introduced this past year with some very modest reforms, but getting at the gross injustice in the system itself truly requires an overhaul. And again, without that overhaul, the state's effort to have any type of equitable adaptation in terms of access to water is just not going to be possible.
Mm-hmm. So we are in the midst of the hearing for phase 2 of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, focusing on the Sacramento River and its tributaries and the Bay Delta and the East Side tributaries. And the governor and others are pushing hard for voluntary agreements that would replace possibly the Bay Delta plan. What can you tell us about the voluntary agreements? Is that something that you paid much attention to while you were at the Water Board?
So I didn't pay a ton of attention to them until it came time to have some discussions about how are we addressing climate change in the flows decisions that the board is making. And first I was told, that I didn't belong in that room. And then secondly, basically that, well, we're balancing needs and there's only so far we can push. And, you know, that is what it is essentially. And, of course, with the board's action on the lower San Joaquin, at least there was initially a decision of more water needs to flow through this river. Maybe it wasn't enough, but at least there was an acknowledgement. And I think where the board is now, and I should differentiate here between the staff and the members, right? I think there are a lot of good people on staff at the water board. And they have tried to really lay out how badly our ecosystems have been wrecked, how decimated the fish and aquatic species have become, and what it would take to really start the restoration project. And there is a staff proposal out there that goes some of the way towards doing that. The voluntary agreements are basically a set of backroom deals engineered to avoid accountability, to avoid regulatory oversight, and to put as little water back into the rivers as possible. And I really think part of the way I look at this is what is the starting point for any analysis here? If the starting point is our goal is to right some of the wrongs, to really focus on ensuring that we can have robust aquatic ecosystems, freshwater aquatic ecosystems, in an era of increasing climate extremes, that leads you down a very different path than if your starting point is what is the minimum amount we can give, the we being people who have access right now and rights to this water, that we can give to potentially avert the worst case outcomes, but prevent us from having to take major cuts. And so that's the voluntary agreement is that approach. It's a what I will call a minimalist approach. And unsurprisingly, it was negotiated in the proverbial exclusionary back rooms. And the fact that this administration is still in such support of it is really a testament to how little concern they have about the political power of the opposition to affect their ability to do what they want.
Mm-hmm. I have a feeling there are a lot of questions people have, so I want to get to that in just a minute. But I did want to get your advice. You had mentioned that Governor Newsom did not reappoint Felicia Marcus after she did such a heroic job leading the water board to a decision on phase one. And within a month, she was replaced. I think that really sent a chill throughout the board. They have a term. They can vote how they want. They can vote their conscience without getting fired, but they just might not get reappointed. What advice do you have for groups like TRT and others on this meeting and our supporters who are willing to speak at the hearing that might influence the board? I see this as a legacy vote, and gosh, I would be so embarrassed that I voted the wrong way on something that affects all future generations, but I don't know if they care.
Yeah, and there are 5 members on that board, and I think there are different degrees of caring. There are different degrees of sort of feeling the weight of the legacy, and different degrees of insecurity, basic insecurity that anyone who has a job who could be, essentially blacklisted, feels. if they sort of go against the powers that be. I think overall, right, this is being driven from above. It is really not, right, five of appointees making independent decisions. It is five people being told what they need to do by their political masters. And I would say at least a couple of those five are looking for ways to do as much as they can within the box they've been put in. But fundamentally, I don't know that that necessarily means, voting to jettison the VAs, for example. So I think in terms of pressure that TRT and other advocates can exert, right? This administration, this governor is responsive to political pressure. They are responsive to bad media. They are responsive to a sense that if they make a decision, that will impact their political prospects. And so I think that the pressure that can be applied in a few different ways. It can be applied through members of the legislature who are not afraid to stand up. It can be applied directly. It can be applied through the media. And it can be applied to, and this one is I will acknowledge, charged, but it can be applied to groups that are otherwise, willing to financially support Newsom. And to say, you know what, you should really rethink that. And here's why.
Great advice. Thank you. Abby, do you want to take over at this point and handle some of the questions from our wonderful attendees?
Yes, of course. So we have some questions in the chat, and people can also raise their hand if you want to come off mute and ask the question live. The first one I'm seeing is from Chris. For part one, there were NGOs involved in the voluntary agreement talks. What's the status of that now?
So I'm glad that someone brought that up, right? I mean, just like agriculture itself is not a monolith, right? You have everything from huge corporate farms to small, family farms. The NGO community is not a monolith either. There are some NGOs that felt like they needed, the best they could do was to be in the room and try to influence things there. And there were a lot of NGOs that felt that the whole process was had a predetermined outcome, and there was, the best thing to do was to boycott and loudly, sort of talk about how unfair the process was. So, there were some NGOs that were involved. In that first time around, as I mentioned, right, that what happened was the board adopted a flow requirement in 2018, and then as soon as Newsom came in and there was the switch out of the board chair, the board immediately put that decision on hold. And so essentially it's never been implemented. And then there was time given for, additional development of agreements amongst the same parties, the utility districts and irrigation districts that sort of are behind the current set of VAs in some cases. So truly the status on those rivers is not a whole lot different than it's been. And that's one thing to note too, right? Where the board is right now is they've put out an environmental assessment of different outcomes under different flow regimes. They haven't actually put out a proposed regulatory program. And they presumably will do that at some point next year. But until they do that, there's no way to know exactly what the rules would look like, what the enforcement would look like, what and sort of how the on paper goal, whatever that ends up being, would be achieved.
So thank you. Conrad, I see your hand is raised. Feel free to, come off mute and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, Conrad with Water Climate Trust. Thank you, Max. Thank you, TRT. As someone who's given decades of his life to advocating with the water board to restore flows, should we not be giving more of our attention now to the governor, given what you've said? And if yes, is there something to be gained by the fact that Newsom is now at least giving lots of lip service to racial equity? Can that be used as leverage for his aspirations and his motivations? Specifically around tribal trust and in-stream beneficial uses of in-stream flows.
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, I think, right, like, again, he is responsive to criticism. I think he's particularly responsive to criticism that comes from Native peoples, that comes from Black and people of color communities. There has been a lot of verbiage produced in this administration about racial equity, not just at the water board, but beyond at the administration level. And the governor himself has, made some high profile gestures of of a restorative nature to Black and Indigenous communities. So I do think there is responsiveness there. If there's a loud enough set of voices saying that what he's doing when it comes to water is a racial injustice, and the louder that becomes, the more responsive he's going to be. So that's, I think, and I guess to the question of, right, where should the focus be? I think it does need to be focused on the administration, on the governor and his senior advisors, not on the water board. I don't think that this board and the members that currently make it up are, while they may listen to the arguments about legacy and how do they want to be remembered, that is not going to be the persuasive element in how they vote.
Thank you.
All right, Jim has a question as well.
Hey, thanks for taking my question. Senior water diverters in the Sacramento Valley are using SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, conjunctive use recharge projects as a Trojan horse to capture Sacramento Valley aquifers to engage in the water market. These aquifers provide base flow to important salmon rearing streams and to valley oak woodlands, as well as urban forests and domestic wells. Conjunctive management typically results in larger than normal declines in local groundwater levels. Are water policy analysts and the water board aware of the consequences of promoting these type of groundwater storage projects in the Sacramento Valley?
Again, I think this goes to the comment I made earlier about the staff. I think the staff that are the experts and have worked there for a long time are aware. At this point in time, the staff are very constrained in what they can do and say. And so when it comes to, just broadly speaking, SGMA implementation, right? The board has, because of how the law was written and because of how this administration operates, is very much has had to wait for DWR to spend a long time on its process, has been limited in what it could say about the broad deficiencies in many of the groundwater sustainability plans. And as many of you know, right, only 6 basins so far have been actually put on probation, even though there are many more than that are severely overdrawn without adequate plans. So, again, it's a function of the overall top-down politics of what gets, what is not going to piss off people who have a lot of sway with the administration when it comes to water board actions. And I think, it's put the board in this really just odd place where the board has publicly said made all these commitments about, racial justice and equity, and about its responsibilities to protect the environment, and then the decisions the board's actually being allowed to make are not in line with those stated objectives.
Well, thanks for answering the question. I was really involved as a stakeholder in the Vina sub-basin up here, and as the environmental representative, and I was really disappointed that my input and the input from the geology professional were largely ignored, and the operating ranges that were finally decided upon were extremely low and appear to be set up to do water banking. So I wanted to alert the other participants here of our concerns about that in the Sigma process. Thanks a lot for allowing me to make that comment.
Thank you, Jim. All right, are there any other questions from the gallery? Or if you want to put it into the chat, now is a good time. Otherwise, Peter, I don't know if you have any additional questions at this time.
Well, I think you're right, Max, that there are a lot of good employees at the water board and their hands are tied. I mean, I deal with people who work for agencies who know they're not doing the right thing. And basically they say, look, I work for a water agency. What do you expect? You're not going to get any better than me. So there's so much compromising that happens at a time when our species can't afford more compromise. Is there a chance more people from the water board might follow your example and just say enough is enough? I can't live this way anymore? Or are they dedicated to keep things from getting worse? What's the mentality there? I know you had some disappointment with some of your colleagues that they were allowing the process to continue.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, it's a big agency. When you count the regional boards, it's well over 2,000 people employed at the water boards, and so there's some variation. I mean, and at the staff level, there's a leadership transition underway right now. There's going to be a new executive director starting early next year, so that may change the internal tone. But what was particularly frustrating to me was basically how, as the board on the one hand was, championing, racial justice and equity, and sort of saying that it was going to do a better job of, protecting the environment than it had in the past. The staff leadership was actively what I would describe as punching down, and making it really clear to staff that we're advocating for stronger protections, that they were going to put themselves in jeopardy if they kept making noise. And I think that was particularly true during the drafting of the racial equity policy, where to the staff that spent so many hours on that, it was so clear that there was just not the will at the top to walk the talk, and that the board's sort of leadership staff was directly there to sort of impede the lower level staff from getting too worked up. So I just, that was really disappointing to witness. And I saw that as well in some of the regulatory work, where it was, you can't push that hard. Like we're not gonna piss off the water agencies that much. So back it down.
You mentioned we will have a new executive director of the water board. Is that a Newsom appointee, and is that going to be a disaster?
So the executive director is a hire of the board. Now, so they're not a direct Newsom appointee. Having said that, of course, again, this board is not independent. It's not that the 5 members of that board will just sort of decide who they want and make a hiring decision. It will go up the chain to the secretary's office, probably to the governor's office. They will they will weigh in. So in that sense, it's somewhat like an appointee. But it's hard to know, right? I mean, the tone for an agency does get set from the top. And again, I'm not here to, excessively criticize the outgoing executive director. But definitely the tone was, we are going to follow the directions from above. And, if you think you can push back on that, think again.
Thanks. We do have another question from the chat from Gabrielle. Can you say more about the proposed regulatory framework? What are the actionable goals? How should water use priorities be decided?
So I think the proposed regulatory framework being referred to here is what's known as the phase 2 flows set of considerations for the Sacramento River and the Delta. So it's interesting. There's 6,000 pages of environmental analysis without a fully transparent and clear set of goals, right? There's no, by implementing this program, we expect to see, this much recovery of these species by this date type of goals. In fact, there's very little information in there about salmon populations specifically. The board just did not include that in its environmental review. So as you go through, you'll see a bunch of other species and sort of, well, if we set flows at this level, we would expect survival rates of, this and that, but nothing for salmon. So, I've heard it said that, part of the goal is a doubling of existing populations. But it's not really defined that way. And again, we won't truly know what the goal is until there's an actual regulatory program released sometime next year. But I think that's a really important question because fundamentally, right, regulations are there to achieve a specific set of objectives. And what those objectives are really matters. Sort of everything flows from that. And it's one thing to say, we're gonna set flows at this level. It's another thing to say, you know what, we're gonna take a comprehensive approach, to our responsibilities here, right? It's flows are key, and operations is key, and temperature is key, and that's all gonna be part of, we're going to put all that together to an objective of, by whatever it is, 2035, right? These ecosystems are going to, look very different, and here's what we expect. That's not really there. And I would say it's a big deficiency.
Thank you for that. Another question that I think will lead us well into kind of our wrap up and how people can get involved. During comments to the water board, is it beneficial to acknowledge that the governor is holding them back, preventing recovery flows?
I don't know that it makes that much of a difference one way or another. I mean, they know what they get told to do. They live it. They know that on just about everything they do, they have to run it up the flagpole. So pointing that out in public, I don't think it makes that much of a difference. Again, I think the pressure that can be applied is the pressure on the governor and his administration, his truly senior level staff. And it's got to be framed in a way of, you do this, there are going to be political consequences. That's what they respond to.
Awesome, thank you. I believe, unless there's any last burning questions anyone has, I'll turn it back over to Peter to share a little bit about the upcoming actions and how you can get signed up to comment.
Well, thank you so much, Max. You really gave us a lot of food for thought and for comments. I hope some people are inspired who weren't necessarily planning on coming to the State Water Board, to take some of the things you learned today and share them with the board. The next hearing date is this Friday, starting at 9:30. I'm guessing it'll probably go most of the day. And again, if you don't have time just to sit at your computer, let me know and I can text you when your name comes up on the scroll. And the final hearing date is December 11th, starting at noon. That's an earlier time than originally posted because they're getting a lot of people signing up. And the written comment deadline has been extended to January 19th. So there are a few opportunities. Some people ask me, are written comments as valuable as in person? I would say in person is much, much more valuable. It shows the water board that there are a lot of people who care, who want to protect beneficial uses, which is their job, and public trust resources, and it holds them accountable. Eyes are watching them. And if you do mention Gavin Newsom, yeah, they know he's the problem, but now they know that the public is watching them to see if they're puppets or if they really will stand up and do what they're legally required to do. So we did have a little training a couple weeks ago. We have a video of that. If you aren't on my list and want to be kept up on updates, please send me an email to peter@tuolumne.org. You just have to remember how to spell Tuolumne. And we have videotaped this presentation. You'll all get a link to that, share it with others. I did get a text during this presentation. A friend said, you know, I tried to get on, but it was maxed out at 100. And I saw someone stepped off and it was at 99. I said, try again quickly. So I'm sure there are a lot of people who wanted to join us, but couldn't because of our limitations. But we will have this available. And again, Max, it is such an honor to get to know you. You are a hero. Heroism will be the focus of my comments, and the world needs more heroes. So thank you. You are an inspiration. And if there's anything you'd like to say to close out, please feel free to. Otherwise, we will hit end.
Thank you again, Peter and Abby, for organizing. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This is important. This is about, you know, our future, our environment, and, you know, and fundamentally about democratic processes. So appreciate your participation.
Well, thank you all, and hope to see some of you on Friday.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I put in a link to the chat as well to find all the details for how to register. And thank you all for coming.